Okay, so welcome to our Emphasize Prevention panel. We're gonna get wonky on you here, okay? Wonky, but really important because we all know, or hopefully we recognize that true change, if we're gonna move the KPIs in this country on how many kids are playing sports, how many coaches are trained, how many kids are just physically inactive. There needs to be systems level change, not just an interesting program here or otherwise. It's been said that in this country we are program rich, but systems poor. And there's no more important organization, I think, in creating a good system than the U.S. Olympic Committee. The USOC has new leadership in the wake of the conviction of USA Gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar for decades of sexual abuse, a terrible story that we are still feeling the ramifications from. When hired, new CEO Sarah Hirshland said, quote, "We must protect, support, and empower athletes, young and old, elite and beginner. Olympic and Paralympic sport in the United States must be a shining example, able to provide athletes with the benefits of participation and an environment free from abuse of any kind." The USOC has made great strides in this area, and I look forward to carrying out that critically important work, unquote. But how best to do that while also helping athletes develop their talent, because we like to see the country represented on the international level in a way that inspires us during the Olympic Games. The answer, some say, and this panel was formed in part because of an op-ed written by Mike Harrigan, who's a friend of Donna's, who made the case that there's an argument to revisit the Amateur Sports Act in this country, and his argument was, no, you don't need to revisit it. You just need to hold the USOC and its affiliated national governing bodies of sport up to the mandate of the ASA, which in 1978 asked those bodies to develop not just elite athletes, but coordinate development of our sports system down to the grassroots. In this session, we'll explore systems level reforms that could be made to prevent all forms of abuse, emotional, physical, sexual, or otherwise, for athletes at all level. And I have a terrific panel of folks who are extremely dialed into this process. These are true thought leaders and well-positioned people to lead this conversation with me. To my immediate left is Donna DeVerona, served on the Presidential Commission in the 1970s that created the Amateur Sports Act. She's a 5-time member of the President's Council, Olympic gold medalist in swimming. Next to her is Alan Ashley, who is the Chief of Sport Performance for the U.S. Olympic Committee. He oversees divisions tasked with providing targeted resources and support to NGBs and top athletes. He's a former Vice President of Athletics at the U.S. Ski and Snowboard Association. And Alan, if you like that course that was introduced earlier today in the Train All Courses session, the free 30-minute course, then you need to shake Alan's hand for getting that out the door. That was his division that said, let's do this. And to Alan's left is Benita Fitzgerald Mosley, who is CEO of the Laureus Sport for Good USA Foundation. She is former Chief of Organizational Excellence at the USOC. She is an Olympic gold medalist in track and has a long list of other titles and associations that will take up the rest of the session if we actually have to read them all. So please forgive me, Benita, for just kind of digging into the questions here. So let's go back to the start. Donna, you were there in the 1970s when the Presidential Commission really looked at what to do with amateur sports in this country, laid the wireframe for the Amateur Sports Act. What did the Amateur Sports Act say? What's your understanding as to what that said about what it asks of the USOC and the NGBs?
Well, before I start, I want to thank you for putting and convening this group of outstanding leaders. I think it's very important for the well-being of the future of sport and fitness in this country that there's an independent group that can have an open dialogue to bring out the issues, to come up with solutions in a safe environment where the leaders in sport can hear you and respond to you, and it gives them a perfect platform to say, the world wants this, we need to change. And in 1972, I came back from covering the Munich Olympics. And at those Olympics, we didn't have official there to really protect our basketball players when the whistle was blown to give more time during the basketball final and the Russians won the game. No one there protected our athletes. When Rick Dumont was disqualified for using asthma medicine, they said he was cheating, no due process. His medals was stripped, he never could compete again. These stories went on, basically because at that time, the Olympic Committee was basically a group of volunteers, all well-meaning, but they didn't have the structure to operate. There were fiefdoms in sport, and there still are. There's silos. You have the NCAA one. In that day, the AAU controlled a lot of sports, and a track and field guy would decide what was going on television. He'd do the television packages for swimming. And of course, again, there was no due process for athletes, and Title IX had just been passed, and women weren't even considered. Athletes had no voice to power. So after those Olympics, and I'm really proud of what Olympians have done and athletes have done in this country when there's a crisis to stand up, a group of us came to Washington. We had to do our homework, and we understood that the U.S. Olympic Committee is chartered by Congress. They're responsible for our charter and our tax standing. At the same time, so we started a lobby in Congress, paid our way, had no money, and said, we can't perform on the Olympic stage like this, it's embarrassing. And our representatives heard the call. They said, how can we send a team to the Olympics and have no one protect them? So out of that, there was a guy, it always takes a leader in the White House, named Mike Harrigan, who'd gone to Penn, he was in track and field, and he waited until Nixon resigned, and Ford became president. Ford loves sports. And he said, we have to put together a commission to look at sports in America because we're out of date. The structure doesn't work. Let's do better. So I was named to a 22-member commission because I had been lobbying along with other athletes. And the trick to this commission was bipartisanship. We had members of the House and the Senate, Republican, Democrat. And we went on a year campaign, went to every single sport body and found out what their needs were. And we put the commission report, we submitted it under Ford, then Carter's elected. And as you know, most times those commission reports are good reading, but nothing happens. Along came the call for the boycott, which was a very sad thing. I never believed in it. But the deal making in politics was the president would support the bill if the U.S. Olympic Committee, which most people don't know, would boycott the games. A lot of us were pressuring not to do that, but the outcome was we passed the Amateur and Olympic Sports Act. At the same time, we had the NCAA lobbying not to be part of it. Our intention under the commission was to be holistic, to get rid of the silos, to have the best resources in America work together. The best training grounds in America are our colleges. We give tax dollars to those colleges. We wanted them to be part of it. We also had a Bill of Rights for athletes. And none of those organizations wanted to have a Bill of Rights. So the compromises were due process. If you had a complaint, you could have due process under the Amateur Sports Act. You could go to a complaint and say, I've been treated unfairly, and you'd have arbitration. And you had a voice. Every single governing body had to have 20% representation by athletes on the board. Probably should have been 30% because that's when you have some leverage. So you look back, it wasn't a perfect thing, but what happened was the AAU was basically put out to pasture and works with mostly basketball. Each sport had the responsibility from top to grassroots to develop programs, to take the money that the USOC could bring in, to spend the money on that, develop programs grassroots to elite, and to protect the athletes and to hear their voices. So that worked well for a while. And then because there were loopholes, the board grew to 100 people, so we had to go back and restructure. And as most organizations have to do, in a time of crisis or in a time when you're not keeping up with the times, you have to restructure. So in 1998, 20 years after the passage of the Amateur Sports Act, we passed the Amateur and Paralympic Ted Stevens Act and included the Paralympics. Unfortunately, Special Olympics is off on the side. That's a whole other discussion. But we wanted a smaller board, and that worked really well. And the failure that happened under this crisis with the Me Too was a failure of ethical responsibility on all levels. It's not just the leaders in sports. It's the parents, it's the coaches, it's the club owners. It's all of us who have to come up with a way to deal with this issue, and it's all over the world. I was just in Argentina, and the International Olympic Committee opened the dialogue because they're dealing with the harassment and how to deal with it in other countries that aren't as up to date as we are. So ultimately, Mike was right. Really. I mean, we have to have responsible individuals, and we have to be open to outside groups like this to listen to how we can improve.
So, but what does it mean? What do they ask in terms of like literally coordinating the grassroots? I mean, obviously the USOC cannot fund everything that's in the grassroots.
No.
Was there any meat on that bone? And if
No,
so, what does that mean?
I think that the situation with Ted Stevens, who was really the grandfather, whenever there was a problem, I would call up Ted Stevens. I was only on the board of the Olympic Committee for a short time, but I was always part of around it. And I would say, Ted, there's something going on at the Olympic Committee. Why don't you give him a call? And that's all it took. But we don't have Ted Stevens in the Senate now. And that's when things started to get wishy-washy. And again, to be honest, the Me Too thing was a perfect storm to deal with the issue. Without Hollywood, without our brave gymnasts coming together at that point, I don't think we'd be having this discussion today, because we knew ESPN did this whole special on abuse in swimming with coaches. But who was listening?
Right.
So to get back to your question is, nobody wants government oversight in every little detail. You give responsibility to a group. This is your responsibility. You have a tax status given to you. It's your responsibility to figure out how to do the grassroots. Right. But a lot of those programs, because of the pressure, sponsorship pressure, networks pressure, trying to get the money, left out that piece and started only focusing on the elite so they could get the rewards for winning gold medals.
Right. So, Alan, you are the chief of sport performance for the USOC. If anybody is held accountable for how well you do, or I mean, your job is to focus on getting people onto the podium. What is your understanding as to what the Amateur Sports Act asks of the USOC related to the grassroots? Because I know you do care about that space. But what is your sense?
Yeah, my feeling is that the Sports Act requires that we look at the entire pipeline, and we need to partner with various organizations in order to get that activation done at the pipeline. And the problem has been, and I think is a lack of real emphasis on standards, on accountability, and then figuring out how to educate and help everyone raise up to those standards and be accountable for execution of it. So everything from, making sure that we have athlete voice, which is really important, and it's really helpful because the athletes have so many things to contribute in terms of better programming and ways to improve our organization. And so when the athlete voice is not present or is muted, we're not as good as we could be. Compliance with the act as it relates to things like grievances. If someone's got a problem with a selection to a team, they need to have a fair, equitable way in order to voice that, so that there's no retaliation, there's no negative feedback to the individual for raising their hand and saying, I don't think this is fair. And so I look at it and I say, I think our role as the U.S. Olympic Committee is to identify what that pipeline looks like with the NGBs, to make sure that we're understand the structure and the way kids come through it, and then to set standards and to try to raise everyone's level to those standards and hold them accountable. And I think it's not mutually exclusive with our responsibilities to the best athletes. We have a whole group of athletes that goes out and represents our country internationally and competes against many nations which have a lot of resources and really want to achieve. And so we want to do that part well, but then I also think we need to elevate our game as it relates to the grassroots, and I think they're both doable.
Yeah. Now, Benita, you have played at multiple levels in a very unique way. Not only an Olympic gold medalist, not only were you chief, a high-ranking official with the U.S. Olympic Committee, not only have you had exposure at the NGB level, but now you are the head of an organization that is working with children, some of the most, vulnerable children in our society. So when we talk about athletes and the obligation to serve athletes, in your mind, does that include the kids that you are now looking after and trying to serve?
Absolutely. I really feel like the term athlete needs to be all-encompassing, and that we really need to feel like kids all kids at all levels, at all, socioeconomic levels, all races, both, all genders need to have equal access to this wonderful thing we call sport. And, our founding patron, Nelson Mandela, said sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It unites people in a way that little else does. And that unification, both at a team level and a community level, at a national level, is something I think that has been driven in large part by the U.S. Olympic Committee for many, many years. We come together around our television sets and now our iPads and computers and phones, every 2 years to really revel in the excitement of the Olympic movement. And with that brand, I think that the USOC can really do more to lend their brand to creating a spotlight on the benefits of sport participation beyond the playing field. Yeah. And it serves two purposes. One, this pipeline that we're talking about to the podium is the money train for the U.S. Olympic movement. Mm-hmm. Not only the USOC, but all the NGBs that they oversee, and all the programs that those NGBs oversee. And to have, childhood obesity rates through the roof, to have the inactivity levels to go as high as they have gone and are going, to have fewer and fewer interscholastic and intercollegiate programs, the USOC has this bully pulpit and should use it in a more, really leverage it in order to shine a spotlight on these issues. And so that, one, it's self-serving. It makes sure that pipeline is filled with healthy, active children that and cast the net as wide as possible to the kids in my program, to the kids participating in youth sports around the country, to get the best athletes in the pipeline so they ultimately can help win medals on behalf of the U.S., but also to serve the public good, both from a health and wellness standpoint, but also all the other great outcomes that we know come from sport participation. I think that not only kind of leveraging the brand, but leveraging partnerships. You just mentioned that. Yeah. Whether it's Project Play or the Women's Sports Foundation, which near and dear to both mine and Donna's heart, or Laurie's Sport for Good. We, Project Play, Laurie, as you kind of look at the two organizations, think we do the same thing, but we do some of the same things, but we do different things. We're more focused on sport participation and making sure we get that right, and make sure it's accessible to all. While we're trying to make sure it's accessible to all, we are really trying to say use sport as a tool to achieve other outcomes around education and employment and social cohesion. And so that is important as well. And then lastly, I think using the voice of the USOC, I know you've been on the Hill for many of the wrong reasons recently, but that ability to leverage the USOC brand to activate at the local, state, and federal levels to change and really change policy to help serve, I think is also important.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, jump in.
Benita, I love what you're saying, and listening to Kobe today, I'd like to wake up every morning with him on the air and hear him talking to me as a parent. We've had incredible sports stars that can inspire. We have the Olympic Training Center. Why don't we have a master of sport courses there, where these fabulous athletes come in and work with the coaches and grassroots coaches. We have what we have online. That's not always possible, but to use our army of ambassadors around the world. Independent organizations do that. We did that with the Women's Sports Foundation when we had no voice. When Title IX was being pushed back, we put together our own organization, we raised our own money, we give out scholarships, and we had a voice on Capitol Hill. And we were able to pressure the U.S. Olympic Committee. And what expanded from that was the tool international groups like Laureus uses to use athletes to go into communities to inspire and to instruct. And there's, as Benita said, there's all different levels. I work with Prince Faisal of Jordan. He started Generations for Peace. He brings in individuals that really want to have peace, and they use the tools of sport and games, and they teach these coaches to go back in their divided communities to get kids together that are refugees or orphans, and they come through this program keeping the values of the Olympics and sport. and they play it forward. So there's so much richness here if we just work together in partnerships.
So one of the things that's interesting too is I think you're absolutely right about the whole training centers.
Yeah.
I mean, those should be institutes.
They should.
And I think that if you look at other countries, they've developed institutes where they not only train athletes, but they train coaches, they train
Norway.
sports science, they train sports medicine, they give athletes tools, so you're looking at the full life cycle of an athlete and you're able to do education, career development. And the training centers are that's a good idea, and it's a good use of a facility that's just centralized where people really want to come and experience the Olympic movement, but also gain education and improve their standards. So again, that's a way to start raising the standards and start delivering a higher quality product. So I agree with you.
I was listening to the gentleman from Norway, and I had the pleasure of going to Lillehammer last year and visiting their sports center and listening to him talk about how you start with values right at the grassroots and how these athletes go through the system, and when they're done, they're not lone rangers that aren't equipped with the ability to make the transition from sport into society. They come through it with friends and values that take them to the next step.
I thought he also talked about how fundamental to what Norway has been able to do was they committed to the right of a child,
Yeah.
the right of a child to a sport experience. And everything, all their Sport for All policies, their funding decisions, their research decisions, everything is based upon that.
But Tom, if you think about it, when we were kids, we all had the right to a sport experience. How was that? Through recess and through PE, right? We had PE, if not every day, almost every day. In PE class, you learned about softball, baseball, volleyball, track.
All the sports.
All the sports. Whatever sport there was, you got to try it for 6-week increments. And now people have shied away from, oh, well, no, everybody can't throw a ball. Well, everybody can't. Well, why can't everybody throw a ball? Like, it's not, we're not all trying to make a Major League Baseball team or the U.S. soccer team, softball team, but everybody should have some basic skills, maybe throw and kick and run and jump, and that's fun. Kids love to do that stuff.
And when we interviewed the 2012 team, the Olympic team, and basically asked them the question, how long did you play multi-sport? And over 70% of them had multi-sport experiences,
Absolutely.
Through high school. And I think
And
one of the
many
things,
through college. It was
yeah,
like
and into
half of them
college.
Or something were two
Yep.
sport athletes in college.
And when you think about that, that is the fundamental of actually learning all those skills and being able to take all those skills and then fine tune them into one sport that you really love. But it's crucial, and that's one of the reasons we were so adamant about Project Play.
Well, you think about PE that's died a death across the country. It's the first thing to go, and we close our parks and lock them, and we don't stay open later because of unions. And we've never been able to attack that problem because we own those spaces. I mean, if you look at a skateboarder, he or she owns that space. You look at a runner, he or she owns that space. We've got to open up those spaces because unless we do, there's still going to be so many young people left out. In the 60s, when I worked for Vice President Humphrey in an inner city program called Operation Champ during the riots, we used to have midnight basketball. What's the matter with that? We used to have flatbed trucks with swimming pools on them we'd take into the community because those kids would never learn how to swim if they didn't have that option. We've lost that creativity, but with a unified voice, with and the U.S. Olympic Committee saying these things, I think we could move the dial. I've always been positive, and when we speak with a lot of voices, using the stars like Kobe, I think you can make impact.
Right. And there's structural things that can be done as well. In fact, I was talking to Max Cobb, who is the head of the National Governing Body Council under the USOC's umbrella, and he was making the point to me that every year we have to turn in a high performance plan to the USOC. They land on your desk, Alan.
Yep.
What are you doing? What are your top athletes? What are you doing to support them, et cetera, et cetera. And then $50 million a year gets dispensed to each of these NGBs based upon the quality of their plan and their ability to put people on podiums. Max was saying, listen, ask each one of the NGBs to turn in a grassroots performance plan as well. What's happening to participation? I'm going to start to put words in his mouth here a little bit, but what's happening to participation? Because I can't remember exactly what he was saying. So sorry, Max.
Okay.
But we can come up. It's all the data points we look at in Project Play. How many coaches? How many of them are women? how many of them are trained? What's the diversity in your participation base? What's the diversity in your coaching base? What are you doing in terms of promoting multi-sport play?
Absolutely.
I mean, a series of checklists and some sort of narrative around that. A, can that be done? And then B, can we put incentives behind that for those who do it well?
It can definitely be done. I mean, and I already see it being done on a really, at a broad level. I mean, I think 18 out of the 50 sports now have American Development Model plans that they're implementing, and they're basically really spending time designing and the architecture of how they are going to encourage youth sport participation in their sports. And so I think that the incentive comes from rewarding them for doing a really good job with that from our standpoint, acknowledging and recognizing them. Yeah, there may be some financial incentives as well, but the first thing is to really develop a culture that says this is important. And this is something not only we're going to require of you, hold you accountable for, but then we're also going to help you. We're going to help you create it. We're going to give you resources. We're going to network you with other organizations that can help you get that plan together and implement the plan. Because, some of these NGBs, like biathlon, they're stretched very thin. We've got to figure out ways not only to set standards in place, but then to educate and help to get to those standards. And I feel like that's part of our responsibility.
And if such a requirement were to turn in ADM plans or grassroots plans or whatever you call it, I mean, could we begin to address the abuse issues more holistically as well by having criteria about safe sport or, or no?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea that there are standards in place as it relates to safe sport training, as an example, and that it's a requirement that people are, have taken the training, and that if they're going to be part of the NGB, they actually, are required to do background checks, safe sport training, and hopefully some minimal level of coaching education or education around sport, so that they may not be, totally good at the X's and O's, but they understand the fundamentals of how to actually teach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think, USA Track and Field, I was their chief of sport. I was, before coming to be his counterpart at the USOC, was one of those people that put one of those plans on his desk every year, a high performance plan. And USA Track and Field has been pretty true to including a development plan for grassroots development within that high performance plan every year. We were also one of the first NGBs when I got there to create a coach's platform to ensure that a coach's registry, to ensure that coaches had background checks, signed a code of conduct, participated in the training that they needed in order to try to move forward this idea of safe sport within our, and set some standards, for behavior. And so it was a hard road at first because, we really felt like we were getting some direction from the USOC. We felt like we saw what had happened with swimming. We didn't want, because very similar sports and widespread and lots of kids and lots of participation at all ages, wanted to kind of get ahead of that a little bit. And it was so funny. It was $35, I think, to be part of the coaches registry, and pretty much that whole amount went to pay for the background check that they had to do not every year, but every 2 years. And it was like they were kicking and screaming because it was just such a paradigm shift for people to be held accountable to a different standard and to a higher standard and kind of change some of the behaviors. Well, I can date my college athlete, or gosh, we're two consenting adults, and okay, it's fine. And in some cases, I'm sure it's been fine, but we had to set a standard that we needed to think about this behavior differently. And so I think it is possible to hold NGBs to this higher standard, to set some expectations for them, in particular around safe sport, as we are now through the Center for Safe Sport, but also to include at the grassroots level not only coach training and kind of the structure, but really how can the kids that participate in that sport, particularly before the age of 12 or 13 years old, get more out of it than just I'm a better hockey player.
Yep. Better experience.
Yes, and for the kids in these under-resourced communities that we're serving, really need trauma-informed coaching. And the idea that these kids can't have coaches yelling and screaming at them all the time. They're the ones who saw their brother killed last year and their, father abused them, or their, violence in their communities all the time. And so when that is present in your life, you need a coach that's really trained to understand the kind of trauma that comes along with that and coach accordingly.
Yeah, and to be a positive person,
Yeah.
to basically teach the athlete how to be independent, to give them constructive, positive feedback and not berating. I mean, I think there's a
Exactly
really
right.
that's a fundamental. If we can get that fundamental concept
gosh.
embedded in our culture, that's how you teach,
For
that's how
all
you
kids.
lead. It would be huge.
Yeah. So Ken, my question for you, and I'll put this to you, Donna, is, can the USOC and the NGB community, the movement, do this on their own, given some of the natural resistance to any kind of change, or do we need Congress to step in? Do we need a voice, someone holding?
I think the new leadership wants to prove they're all in. Suzanne Lyons, who's our IOC member now, and Sarah. But I think it's really important we keep the pressure on, because it gives them the strength and the backing to do what they need to do. Because there are players in the Olympic community that feel like, I don't want to be told what to do. One of our biggest hurdles was getting clubs to sign on and say, yeah, we will register people, we will train people. What does the Olympic Committee have to do with my little club that I put together in my community? Leave me alone. So I think we have to keep the pressure on, because that only helps the new leadership do what they need to do.
Great. I think I failed to give you Slido question instructions midway through the panel. So is anybody from our staff in the room here?
Yes.
Rania.
Hello.
There you go. Randy, do we have anything?
Yes, we currently have one question, but that is a good prompt and reminder to please input your questions. Our first question is, does the USOC support the LTAD across all sports, and will it be placed into developmental policy?
Yes, we do support it across all sports, and it is. We don't have policy per se, but basically we are working with every single national governing body on developing their ADM plan, which is American Development Model, long-term athlete development. They go like this. They're the same thing, and it is really, really important because one of the things I want to say about that is the future of the Olympic movement and long-term, how well we are represented when we go to the Olympic Games is going to be a factor. It's going to be influenced by how well we teach young people to enjoy sport and to really imbibe in sport and be completely committed to sport, because as more and more kids find it hard to participate, eventually that starts to really hurt our ability to actually have individuals rise and become Olympic and Paralympic champions and represent our country. And so I have as the person that's responsible for helping to put resources, towards the top, I have a really big interest in making sure that lots and lots of kids participate and enjoy sport. And so this LTAD concept is crucial.
Last thing, realize we're over here a little bit. So very quickly, run down the line. Do we need to, Mike Harrigan argues we do not need to open up the Amateur Sports Act. It just need to be held accountable. But very quickly, yes or no, do we need to open up the thing and make any adjustments? Or are we good and it's just a matter of accountability and refocusing?
I think we have to wait and see, because all these lawsuits have to play out. When it comes to Me Too, we have to wait and see a while to see what Sarah and Suzanne Lyons do in the leadership. And I think that we also, I'm going to add this, we also ought to call into question the NCAA and the colleges and get them to participate, because without the full community, how are we going to resolve protecting athletes and giving them a voice and treating them the way they should? Not just as property, which they really are looked at, the players in the game that makes money, that promotes the next thing. We got to do more for them, especially when they retire and make the transition. So right now I say not ready to open it up, but I would keep the pressure on.
Yeah, that's a good point you make about the schools. We have to continually remind ourselves the youth sport landscape has been transformed over the past 20, 25 years by the chase for the athletic scholarship. So I do think the NCAA and the schools need to play a role in this conversation and be part of the solution as well. So with that, it's time. It's actually overtime, and
Wow.
a great place to wrap. I want to thank our panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks, Donna.
Thank you.